Welcome to the Cypher Podcast. I'm Brett Stewart, your co-host, along with Emily and David. And in today's show, we're going to be talking about an Egyptian god. And it's kind of an interesting parallel to what's in popular culture. There's that show called Moon Knight that's pretty popular over on Disney+. We're not going to be talking about those Egyptian gods. We have a slightly different one in mind here with our remote viewing data today. And that's the Egyptian god Thoth. So you may have heard him. He's related to the Emerald Tablets and several other things, which we will get into. But before we dive in, I do want to let everyone know that we do have a premium after hours episode that follows this main show, which we create for free for everybody. So if that interests you, definitely head over to our website. It's cypher.com or remoteviewingpodcast.com. You can register to become a member and then become a subscriber to support the show. This helps us create additional content, keep the lights on. Also, if you listen to us on iTunes, please leave us a 5-star review. It definitely helps us a lot. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Emily. Emily, maybe you can tell us a little bit about our god Thoth. Who is he and what is he known for?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. As you mentioned, Thoth is an Egyptian god. He's most commonly depicted in art with the head of an ibis, which is an African bird, has a very long curved beak. And it's thought that this long curved beak symbolizes the crescent moon. He's the Egyptian god of the moon, wisdom, writing, science, magic, art, and judgment. So he's got a lot of things on his plate. He's credited for so many things we have in our modern day culture. One of the most notable things, or something that stands out, is the 365-day calendar. So this was a being that had a lot of very interesting knowledge around math, science, magic, art, and brought all those things. So Thoth is also known in many different cultures under many different names. David, I know you have some information for our listeners on perhaps some of the other cultures that have a similar Thoth archetype or being.
Well, you said Thoth is responsible for wisdom, writing, science, magic, art, judgment. That's a lot of stuff. So we can't necessarily say in other cultures, oh, it's exactly the same. But in the Norse mythology, I think Odin is a close analog. Hermes as well. I mean, we find Thoth referred to as Hermes Trismegistus because of some Egyptian Greek culture swapping after Alexander the Great invaded Egypt. So certainly Thoth and Hermes have a lot more in common. Hermes being the messenger god with the winged sandals and now a courier company here in the UK. I don't know if you guys have the joy of Hermes deliveries. But these concepts of being a scribe, a scholar, science, magic, judgment, and understanding, these are quite universal things, right? So you could almost say that Thoth is one label that's been stuck on maybe even like an archetypal, non-physical force that is showing its face in different ways through Thoth, Hermes, Odin, and I'm sure many other figures throughout history.
Well, thanks for that background, David. I want to prepare the listener for what we're going to have as a different type of show. Previously, we've done RV sessions as the basis for our show, where I task David and Brett to go look at a target and we come back with the data. In this particular episode, we're going to have a different structure, and we're doing something called a cowboy session, and it has some elements of channeling in it as well. I think David can probably best describe that to you and how it's going to be different from our other work we've done.
Sure. So our usual paper-based RV or ERV sessions, Brett and I get given a target reference number. We're completely blind. We work on our own. We record our data, and then we send it back in before we find out what our target was. So we work on our own. We make our own record. The cowboy session, as it's called, it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name. This was originally conceived as a way to do essentially magical evocation, speaking to spirits, deities, that kind of thing, but within the remote viewing protocol, so the viewer is still blind. Because if I say to you, I want you to channel the god Thoth for me, your imagination will immediately kick in and come up with a bunch of stuff, and you'll be thinking, oh yeah, that's the one from Egypt, right? He's got the head of you'll imagine stuff, right? So we can keep the viewer blind, but still be using a modality, I suppose you'd say, which is not what we would be doing if we were doing a remote viewing session. Sometimes where you've got deities, spirits and things, then the experience of interacting with these psychically is much more like speaking to a person. Occasionally it feels like picking the phone up. You can just hear them talking. It's kind of creepy. So I think that you could nearly call that channeling. I think some people would use the word channeling to mean that they're kind of almost partially possessed by a spirit. They're giving over part of their autonomy and something else is using their mouth to speak. Whereas what Brett and I are doing is more like a psychic telephone call, I guess. We're not being possessed by Thoth. And there are aspects of remote viewing in what we're doing as well. So we'll be receiving visual imagery, we'll be asking questions. Sometimes in these sessions, it really isn't like picking up a phone, especially if what you're targeted with is not real. But in this instance, I did a cowboy session on Thoth first, which unfortunately not very good records were kept, so a lot of that has been lost to time. And then later I tasked Brett on it. So he was blind. He was just sat there having a conversation with me and a couple of other people. He didn't know what the target was, and we did. So we were asking questions in a non-leading way, and he was just kind of serving as the telephone to talk to Thoth. Just one more item of trivia on cowboy sessions. Why are they called cowboy sessions? What's this got to do with cows? We came up with this idea as an experiment, and we asked Daz Smith, famous remote viewer, to join in. We said, why don't you come and have a go? You know, it'll be fun. And he said, I'm not doing any of that cowboy stuff. So from then on, we called them cowboy sessions as a tribute to Daz's disdain. And there is a technical point to his skepticism of this approach, in that the monitors, that is the people asking the questions, are not blind. So there is the chance of either people asking leading questions or cold reading, or there's many more opportunities for information leakage, which in an experimental context is really problematic and dodgy, right? Because how can you say it was psychic if there's somebody sitting in the room having a conversation with the viewer who knows what the target is? In this context, we're all remote viewers. Nobody's cheating. As monitors, we're trying really hard not to ask leading questions. We don't want to give it away because that will mess up what the viewer's doing if they have a conscious idea of what the target is. So that's cowboy sessions for you.
So now that the listeners know what a cowboy session is, Brett, why don't you tell us where your session started? Where did you sort of land when you first connected to this Thoth entity? Did you encounter like a physical life form, or was it more of a non-physical being? What was your initial experience?
Sure. When I go into this, I really don't have any expectations about what my attention is going to get put on. When I sit down to do a cowboy session, I know that the tasker is intending me to have a kind of a dialogue with something. So like David said, it's not channeling. I'm not letting something come in and take the wheel and speak for me. I'm just having what would be akin to an out-of-body experience, having a discussion in the ether. Where I landed at the very beginning of this session was with a very unique type of life form. And I was getting two different key aspects of it. So it started off very metaphoric and symbolic. Later on, I was able to actually dive in more specifically to each part of this life form. But I was getting just more of a descriptive remote viewing kind of analysis of what this was. I was dealing with a life form that had a past incarnation somewhere in time, but that there was this other aspect of them that also existed that felt almost non-physical. Like it wasn't a person in the way that we would see a person walking down the street. It was a force of some kind. And then later on, I actually had a discussion with this. So the visuals that I was perceiving first was an underground ancient tomb. And it looked like I was seeing a sarcophagus or some sort of a square box that a body would go into, which was the idea that this was someone who had perhaps lived a very long time ago. They were important enough for a tomb to be built for them, and I saw a skeleton in the tomb. It was just someone's old body. This is where they are perhaps now. So it was this idea that they're not this is not someone who's walking around and living today. This is an ancient individual who's now dead. One of my analogies was like the tomb of Christ. this felt like a religious figure, a human who had lived a long time ago. That's where it began.
So, David, I know you had a slightly different first impression when you had your cowboy session on Thoth. Was that also physical, or would you characterize it differently?
Well, the impression I got was eventually it resolved to being just kind of archetypal. It didn't have much of an appearance. I did have a few visuals of, I think I remember I saw like a raven or a crow, which apparently is how Odin presents itself. But they weren't, I'm having a conversation with this, just like Brett's tomb was a symbolic, meaningful graphic. That was kind of what this was. Here's a picture of a crow. This is relevant. And then back to, now I'm just talking with the void. At some point, we kind of looked at where is it? And I said, it's everywhere. Like it's just below the surface. It's kind of like dust motes twinkling in the light shining through a window. It's just kind of subtly everywhere. And then one of the monitors asked the question of Thoth when I was doing the session, did you write the emerald tablets, I think? Because there's lots of writings which are attributed to Thoth or Hermes, right? I think we'll touch on that later. So the question was, did Thoth write it? And it said, well, I wrote, like, I didn't write it, but I'm in every book. You can find little bits of truth everywhere. It was very hand-wavy, for want of a better name. It was very nebulous, the thing that I was talking with. I mean, it was still interesting. That was what inspired us to do the session with Brett.
Yeah, when I looked at the other aspect of the life form in my session, I got something that was very distant. And so it's something that almost felt like an energy force that had a relationship with the planet Earth. And so I was asked, describe the interest and motivation of the life form. And when I posed that question to the non-physical kind of remote energetic version, it described that its purpose was to act like an aqueduct. So bringing water, which I interpreted as information, from afar to here, to humans, to Earth, and that it would bring spiritual growth and learning so that we can grow. So this is, again, tying into even what I had before, where I had an AOL of this is like the tomb of Christ. This felt almost like a religious or spiritual teacher. It's like they have a constant energetic exchange with Earth, is what I perceived. Metaphorically, they view themselves as like a parent and Earth as a child. They are much more advanced than the inhabitants of Earth, but there's this key core concept of like seeding life. There's an energetic exchange that has a positive effect on the nature of us here. It's like giving water to a plant so that it can grow, be fruitful, and multiply.
So it's interesting that I have an archetype that's everywhere, and then you have a physical incarnation, and would you say a non-physical force that still had kind of form and locality in space or time?
Yeah, that's exactly what I had. And that was the interesting thing about the life form is I had, here is this life that someone lived. They're now dead. They're buried in a tomb. But there's this other thing that exists in time and space that is really relevant to the question that seems to be non-physical. And I'll talk more about what that is later. But yeah, it seemed like there was like a duality there on this idea.
So I think this goes back to the idea that we have Hermes and Thoth and Odin and all of these different authors purporting to be writing as Thoth over the years. An analogy is like the way mushrooms grow. Under the ground, there's this vast network of mycelium and you never see it. And the mushrooms just pop up almost randomly, unpredictably. And they're like the visible part of it. And it's all one huge organism. But all you see from the surface is just these little mushrooms fruiting occasionally. So maybe that's one way to look at the way phenomena like this can manifest throughout time and space.
Yeah, I think that there are some beliefs that a lot of religious teachers are like that, is that they come from a source. It's like that energy pattern is having an incarnation here on Earth as a spiritual teacher. Christ might be one of those. Buddha might be one of those. The idea of Melchizedek might be one of those. Is different incarnations to bring about a spiritual learning or growth here on the planet. But they would need a human body in the first place to do that. So perhaps that's what this was.
Right. So now that we have a good sense of where you came into the target, so you started out with this life form at a particular incarnation in the past. Do you know or get a sense in your session about where this being is now? What would be the present day context of this being? Another incarnation, perhaps, or something else?
Yeah, that was one of the questions I was asked by the monitor. which was asked, where are they now? And the scene changed just like it would in an ERV session where I'm getting a series of images and experiences. And where I moved to was vast, distant space, nowhere near Earth. And so I saw stars. It's like I was kind of floating out in empty space. And in all directions, I'd see stars and nebula, and just floating along right in the middle of all this was a boat, interestingly enough. And I thought, well, maybe this must be a metaphor. And likely it could be a metaphor because maybe what this actually looks like isn't something that is physical, was my assumption. But I saw a boat floating in space, and the boat was made of wooden planks. And it looked like an ancient boat that just happened to be cruising the universe out there. And I got the impression of that this wasn't any kind of ordinary boat. It did feel ancient, but it had vast sails. And there was this one really large mast in the center of the boat and was carrying it along. And it had ideas of something like solar sails. It was like the submarine Nautilus from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, except imagine an ancient boat made of wood. So other relevant visuals that I got is you can imagine this really long ancient boat. It had a sphere near the front of it as well. I wasn't sure what that was, but it was a really prominent feature. And then on the very front of the boat, there was a character, kind of an emblem carved into the front that you would see on like a seafaring vessel as well. So it was really a strange sight to see, but I'm pretty sure, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but Thoth is often seen on one of these boats on the Nile River in the actual Egyptian mythology. Is that correct?
That's right. So there is definitely a element of what you had in your session that ties right back to Egyptian mythology and lore. So perhaps you were picking up on that sort of aspect of it. That was an entry point for your subconscious mind to connect to something that you would recognize or something that you would know. And perhaps the ancient Egyptians were tying into this as well. They were also getting a similar download about how to think about this character, this being.
Yeah, it's using the vocabulary of those that came before us. And so an ancient culture knows boats, and it knows it's interacting perhaps with some force in space. So they would put a boat in space. Now, if I'm dealing with the concept of Thoth, perhaps that's why I picked it up in the same visual in my session. So it's an interesting point because I feel it leads credence to the fact that I'm barking up the right tree here because these are elements that are feedbackable about Thoth. But it still is strange in the sense that I see a wooden boat in space. What I concluded is that this feels more of like a non-physical representation of some sort of energy source that is not from around here and or is not even here right now. So it felt really far removed from the planet Earth.
Before we get into the next round of data, I want to give the listener a little bit of a backstory on what Thoth wrote. So there's a compendium of writings that Thoth is purportedly responsible for writing. One of the most popular ones or well-known ones is the Corpus Hermeticum, which is the basis for Hermeticism. There's also the Asclepius, which is known as the Perfect Sermon. And there's the Emerald Tablet, it's where we get the saying, as above, so below. And I know, David, you've read the Emerald Tablet. Do you have any connections between what we're getting in our sessions and the Emerald Tablet? Do you want to share that with the listener?
Sure. The Emerald Tablet says a lot of stuff, and it's written in quite a cryptic. I mean, I believe it has been translated from Arabic, which may not help, but like many of these kind of esoteric, philosophical, ancient texts, it's using a symbolic language and physical metaphors for pretty out there, highfalutin, woo-woo spiritual concepts. One thing which ties back into some work that we did in a previous show is about Atlantis. It describes these beings, these sort of divine beings that live underground, and they live even below Atlantis, the halls of Amenti. It strikes me that there's this idea of Atlantis being not a time in the past, but kind of a less materialized or less evolved version of creation itself. So it's not like planet Earth was the same, but Atlantis was on it. It's like this is almost a different kind of space. This is a higher plane of existence. So that these divine beings are described in the Emerald Tablet as being underground, even below Atlantis. You could actually flip that on its head and say, actually, they're above. They're even less physical. They're even closer to the divine. They're even more strange and mysterious and outside the flow of linear time. just an idea, but I think it ties in with that idea of Atlantis as something that isn't a nuts and bolts physical thing necessarily. And it ties that idea into what I was talking about earlier of the mushrooms, that you have the non-physical spiritual thing that's in some way atemporal, which incarnates here and inspires an author there and has a physical body there, or indeed a flying space boat that may not be physical somewhere else, and that this is all kind of connected together through these higher planes of existence, which are, I believe, described in the Emerald Tablet. I haven't read the whole thing recently, but anyway, it goes on to explain in these halls of Amenti below Atlantis, so on a higher plane, a higher spiritual plane, these people with their sleeping bodies, they're asleep in these halls, and they incarnate as humans from this location. So it's saying they're in bodies and they're sleeping, but while they're sleeping in these bodies, they're incarnating. So, I mean, it's just an idea, but I feel like it sort of ties a lot of disparate threads together there.
What's interesting, in the remote viewing session, I was asked quite a bit of questions about the life, the ancient life that they're now buried in the tomb. When I was getting descriptions about the type of culture that they were in, the type of parallels that line up with ancient Egypt or even Atlantis, came through right at the very beginning. And so, just to paint a picture of who this person was, I described them as like a Galileo type figure. They were a builder and an inventor. And it's like when I went into their quarters or where they lived, I was going into an invention lab. I saw models of the sun and the planets. I saw a telescope. I saw many other inventions, electricity, things of that nature. And this person, when they were alive, took great pride in these objects, and they took great pride in their understanding of these objects. But this is far before the Renaissance. Like, I'm in ancient culture right now, which doesn't quite fit the traditional line of history. Now, the monitor asked me, what type of culture did they live in? And immediately from the life form, I got a strong sense of sadness. And it wasn't because necessarily they had loss, but it was because they felt like a life form out of time. Their society was very, very simple. Humans at this point were not very evolved. They didn't have a lot going on upstairs in that brain of theirs. They knew, put seed in ground, put water in dirt, seed grow. That's what humans could figure out. Math, not a big thing, but that's where they were at.
When you remote viewed the Atlantis thing, possibly at the Reichardt structure, didn't you describe the humans there as being like really quiet and just kind of trundling along, and they didn't seem very dynamic? Was that a similar kind of thing to what we're talking about here?
It's very, very similar. In the Reichardt structure, which is a previous episode that we recorded, the humans there, it's like the humans weren't speaking words. Everything was so quiet, and everyone was also very, very simple. It was very egalitarian society. Everyone was equal. Everyone was very put together and seemed to have a purpose, but everyone also seemed very simple. It's like the whole society was full of simpletons. So how they could have gotten such a magnificent city built is a little strange. But this is in the same vein, where the society itself was just very simple human beings. They didn't have a lot going on upstairs. I don't believe that this is necessarily the Reichardt location, but it could be in that same kind of era.
So Brett, just so that I can paint a picture in my mind on where we're at here, we are making connections that it could be similar to what we got from the Reichardt structure. However, it's not necessarily there. It's sort of ancient Egypt, how it would have been at a similar time. Is that a good way of understanding it?
Perhaps. Again, I can't really put exactly where in time we are, but we are definitely ancient civilization, likely lost to time. Like, we don't have stories of this time.
So could the Egyptians have actually inherited this story from a previous era? It sounds to me like that's where we're really headed with our data. It's that we've got this godlike figure that the Egyptians are saying, okay, there is this god. Maybe it was just sort of through mythology that they were paying reverence to Thoth, but Thoth actually existed as a being in a previous sort of civilization, sort of a primordial or base civilization that then went over into the Egypt that we know of today. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that that is closer to what I was getting here. The Egyptian society, which is why I also got like, it almost feels Atlantean, whatever that means, which just means something distant, mysterious, ancient civilization, but also Egyptian too. I was getting really strong Egyptian vibes. Also, what I'm aware of in Egyptian society, which there was a parallel here when looking at this individual, is that there was a caste system, which means there was a priest class, there was a working class, there was like an intelligentsia ivory tower. They had all the knowledge. I know how electricity works. I know how the plow works. They held all the knowledge away from everybody else. Now, whether that was because it was for their own good or, the reasons, well, yeah, it's probably debatable. It certainly was. There was a ruling class that had knowledge and everyone else didn't. They were very, very simple and they were sectioned off from everybody else. It was like he was part of a priest class in Egypt. Whether or not this is exactly Egypt, I can't tell. This may be a precursor to Egypt.
Well, there certainly are notions of the Egyptian priest class hoarding the secret knowledge, and there being many later authors who've claimed to have access to this secret knowledge. It's not really recorded anywhere, as far as I know, so it makes it quite difficult to say who might be making more or less accurate claims about having the secret knowledge of the Egyptian priesthood, but I'm pretty sure we don't know what it was, so they did a good job of keeping it secret.
There's one final question here that was asked by the monitor. The monitor wanted to know, how did this society relate or compare to modern day society when it comes to technological advancement? Did they have similar technology? Were they still really rudimentary? And when I looked, I was actually rather impressed by the technology, but it was different. Today we use computer chips and LCD screens. These things back then would have been viewed as magic. It's something that is outside of what's known and what's possible. But what I noticed is that they had different ways of achieving similar things. And this technology, it was relegated to a really small group of people. The common man wouldn't even have had an understanding of it back then. They would have thought it was magic. But this technology seemed related to the use and application of crystals in some way. I know in After Hours, we're going to talk a little bit more about that and how that's used. But it was a different kind of advanced technology. If you were to take a step back, modern day technology would be more advanced. We have more advanced technology than they had back then. They just had a different kind of technology that was not quite as far along as what we have today.
I'm curious, Brett, how would you say that perception of technology you had there does relate back to what we were talking before with the Ricotte structure? Is you get a similar sort of vibe with the technology in this session and the technology that you perceived at the Ricotte?
It's very similar. It's in the same vein. One of the key elements I had in my session with the Ricotte was this platform for transportation that was just kind of moving on its own. And there didn't seem to be any engine or steam power or electronics going on. It just moved and people just said, yep, that's what this thing does. And I feel like it's more that kind of technology, which is also why it's reminiscent of that work. Same era.
So we have a very good sense, I think, now of what this person, Thoth, was like. I'm curious, Brett, did you have any data in your session that talked about how people perceived him? Like, how was the society around him looking at him as a figure?
Well, it definitely wasn't a spiritual teacher. It seemed that this individual brought technology and knowledge and understanding to the society, didn't necessarily bring spiritual growth. Because when I went to the society itself and I put my lens back at this person, what do you think about them? What I got was not positive whatsoever. The very first word that popped into my mind was murderer. It was someone who they viewed as a despot, a tyrannical ruler, someone who made kind of big decisions that affected the lives of humans everywhere, that maybe it was for the greater good. It certainly didn't view every human life as precious. So it's almost like a utilitarian tyrannical ruler. Then when I went to the life form with this, and I said, well, how do you feel about that? There was actually regret. There was regret and sadness, where it's almost like if this was an incarnation of some larger archetypical force that exists in the universe, it didn't necessarily do the best job during its life. It seems like it has regrets and it has sadness associated with it because of the outcomes. And this was one of them. It's just the way that the modern man of that era viewed him. It was not positive at all.
So this place with the very simple people and the priest class, was this ancient Egypt, do you think, or was it Atlantis? I know in your session you were asked about Atlantis, or rather you asked Thoth about Atlantis. What did he have to say about that? How does that relate to these people and this priest class?
So I got a really weird answer from Thoth on this one. And this wasn't a leading question because he came up with it of his own accord, saying that this place is like Atlantis in ancient Egypt. And then the monitor simply said, well, what does this life form think of Atlantis? I perceived as the response is it considers Atlantis its home, but then it made a cheeky response after that and said, but home is where the heart is, so maybe not is the answer. And then right after that, it scolded the monitor and said, you don't even know what Atlantis was. So when you're asking your question, it's a silly question that you're asking, because the Atlantis that you're asking about is a fairy tale. It's not real. And then the monitor asked, well, what is Atlantis then, in your opinion? And Thoth responded, Atlantis is a story for children. Asking what Atlantis is a silly question because it's like a movie. And you're asking me, what's my relationship to a movie in a movie theater? As well, it's just a story. There is a version of Atlantis that did exist, but it's not what people believe. The real version was grandiose and it would blow your socks off in a similar way to going to Disney World is grandiose. And there's some fascinating rides and you can buy some candy and there's all of these adventures to go on and it's all very, very exciting, but it's all a facade. This life form was telling me that Atlantis wasn't a real city. It was like a fake city where there were larger intentions behind it. And since humans weren't exactly the brightest bulbs in the bunch at this point in history, they were brought in to have an experience of what having a high civilization was like, to experience it without ever having to actually build it from the ground up in the first place. And so Atlantis is a story, just like Disney World is a story. You could go there. It did exist in physical reality at one point, but it never was a real civilization. It was like a mock-up civilization for simple humans to experience what it would be like sometime in the future.
Brett, as you mentioned that, this really reminds me of some data that David had in the recon structure where he said that there was this city there, but it was all about viewing it from a certain lens, almost sort of like an angle that it had to be perceived through, like a show or a facade or trying to impress people in a certain way. So that just jumped right out at me as you said that.
Damn, that makes sense now. That's amazing. Look at that. Our remote viewing data is forming this like multi-episode narrative without us even knowing, because there's the phenomena of viewers sharing the load on a single target. But I guess because we're doing this every week, we're actually sharing stuff out over time as well. That's so cool that doing this Thoth thing has made sense of the Reichardt thing. That's amazing. What a cool idea. I wonder if that's true. So I described it as, I'm pretty sure I actually AOL'd Disneyland, animatronic dinosaurs kind of idea. But, you know, in Disney World, all of the sightlines are really carefully controlled. And I had this idea of like, you come around a corner and you see this vista and everything's kind of arranged. Not exactly in it's not artificial, but it's like an architect has laid it out to give a certain appearance. And then this vehicle starts moving and it's all this cool experience. But that it was designed to be viewed from that one perspective, which I guess is perhaps a physical analogy slightly that you could extrapolate to the perspective being living in Atlantis as one of these simple proto-human beings, right? And I'd kind of experienced that as actually walking along a path and going around a corner and seeing this presentation. I thought it was like maybe going to be when the fake Loch Ness monster where they like have the wooden head sticking out and they're pulling it along on a rope on a submerged thing. It was that kind of like, oh, we're creating this show. And I said of the audience, they want to believe. They're enthusiastic, they're willing, they want to see what if, they want to imagine and have an excuse to imagine something bigger. So that's actually such a cool point, Emily. That really makes sense now. We're going to have to do some more work on this in future.
Yeah, that's exactly what Thoth was indicating the true story of Atlantis was about. It wasn't this monumental human achievement. It was a ride that was created by some other group or force to try and unlock the potential that humanity had at that point in time. Therefore, all of these previous versions of like, oh, Atlantis, so this holy remembering of a city, of the greatness of humanity, it's like a child going to a theater and imagining that what they saw in the movie was their upbringing. It's not real. It's a story for children. That's exactly what I got. There were parallels in physical reality to that story to make it more compelling for humans at that time. but it wasn't actually real, just like Disneyland isn't real. It was just a facade. There was an intelligence behind the curtain. It's a Wizard of Oz show.
I think you actually described in the recut structure a temple that was actually at the center that was almost built for these non-human or non-earthly beings, almost like a throne room, I think you said. And that totally fits with what you found in this session, I think.
It had empty thrones, didn't it? Please don't tell me that it had 32 thrones like the sleepers in the halls of Amenti.
I don't remember seeing 32 thrones, but it is a fascinating idea conceptually, is that, let's say, the Rykot structure was a real place, and there was a temple in the center, and there was even a throne room for those who built it. And the people in that city said, yes, that's where they come from, the sky. They're the gods. They helped us become what we are today. But then they left the throne empty. Well, sure, that makes sense. I mean, if you're someone who built Disneyland for children and you build this amazing castle, it's nice and pink, it's got amazing walls and some awesome rides on it, and it's all fun, and you build a throne for Mickey Mouse, why in the world would you want to go sit on Mickey Mouse's throne as the architect of this experience? It's a meaningless throne. But to those in the experience, just like the children in the experience of Disneyland, view it with awe and wonder. And it unlocks something within a child to go to a place like this because it unlocks their creativity and their imagination. I feel like these kind of ancient cities were designed to do that for humans. They were designed to try and unlock something bigger that was within us all, or within the people of that time. I think we're different than the way they were back then. But it had no inherent value. Like, why would you sit on that throne? It would be silly. It'd be sitting on Mickey Mouse's chair. And it just doesn't make sense.
So people, even today, are still inspired by the stories of Atlantis. Does this mean that those stories are like stories of Disneyland?
It's funny because you could argue the context has been lost to time, but I don't know if we ever had the context, even in the human experience and the journey from that ancient civilization to modern man. The context was intentionally withheld. And so even if there's something like genetic memory or some unconscious memory that lasts through time, where people have remembrances of the grand Atlantis, they perceive it as if it was a real thing. And there never was told to them that it wasn't, that it was a facade. But I don't think that this takes away the value of it. Just because this was a show, just because this is like a Disneyland event, I mean, does that make it any less amazing or valuable to a child? No, humanity was in its infancy at that point. And this was something that some group or some force decided that let's help out. And this is what Thoth, going back to the metaphor at the very beginning, what is his energy a part of? It's like bringing water from a distant place off to increase the life essence, to increase spirituality, to increase the knowledge and acceptance of wisdom to a place where it doesn't exist. And I think that's what whoever built this was trying to do. It's not nefarious, and I don't think it demeans it in any way. It was really valuable. But now that, just like when a child grows up, they can look at Disneyland and view it for what it is. Oh, it's a fun park where I learned a lot and I had a lot of amazing experiences. They're not going to idolize it. And I think that's probably the proper relationship to have to it today.
So wrapping things up here in this episode, we've gone on a bit of a exploration of who Thoth was. I hope the listener now gets some sense, at least from our remote viewing perspective, what this being was. Certainly do your own research, make up your own mind. I know that the session that you had, Brett, takes a little bit of a turn after this point, and we're going to save that for the after hours, where the moderator of the session actually asks you what Thoth thinks of RV and what are the implications of Thoth's advice for RVers and how all that works. Do you want to give them a little bit of a teaser as to what we can expect?
Yeah, after we kind of got the backstory and the history and all this Atlantis stuff, Egyptian gods at the beginning, it kind of became a bit of a round table where people were asking, I got my question for whatever this is. And they were all blind too. They still didn't know it was Thoth. So in the after hours, we talk about we got some pretty interesting questions that were asked. And so one of the first questions that was asked as a bit of a preview is, I was asked, what does this thing think about remote viewing? And my perception of it, as I was seeing it in my mind's eye, it just laughed and it said, well, you're here, aren't you? Like I was like I'm doing this communication through space and time. It's like, it's pretty cool. It had a sensation of, it felt proud, even though how it represented itself in this particular incarnation is what it seemed like in the past. It had sadness around it. The fact that there's a human here now communicating with it in this environment, there was a sense of pride. It's like a parent feeling like their kid was achieving something on its own and be like, that's awesome. And so it said, good for you. It's about time. Like it had been waiting. Like this is a lot of time had passed since this original inception of the story. Then it said, there's a whole lot more to remote viewing though. Remote viewing is just dipping your toes in the water. And then the monitor asked next, well, what's the next thing about remote viewing? What's the next appropriate step? And it was at this point that it became really, really clear that I was dealing with an Egyptian god, because it morphed into the body of a man with the head of an animal. In the session, I said, it's like this is reminding me of Anubis. I didn't get quite that it was exactly the ibis bird, but it was essentially, I was talking to an Egyptian god is what I perceived. And what's funny is it paused for a moment and it thought, and it pulled up this little thing that looked like a little computer, looked like an iPad. And then it asked, well, what purpose do you want the next step to be after remote viewing? Your intention matters. You need to narrow a question. Do you want to dominate, overthrow, and destroy things? Do you want to heal things? Do you want to teleport? And then showed me an image of being in two places at once and says, what do you want to know? And I think that's where we'll teleport to after hours and we'll talk about the rest here, because there's a lot that Thoth went into. We talk about crystals. People ask about the planet, why things are the way they are right now. And there were some practical how-tos that we'll get to. So we'll do that in after hours. This is a good place to wrap the show up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the ancient history of Thoth as much as we did. Join us in After Hours. If you want to hear the rest of the story, to do so, you can go over to our website at cypher.com or remoteviewingpodcast.com. You can register and then subscribe to become a premium member to get all of our After Hours shows. They definitely help us keep the lights on and make more of this awesome content for you guys. If you're not ready to sign up just yet, please share this show with your friends. We're definitely a new podcast, so any type of support and sharing goes a long way. And you can always, if you're listening on Apple Podcast, give us a 5-star review. That goes a long way as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Emily and David. And we'll see you, the listener, in After Hours. Take care, everybody.